most movies always portray a certain aspect of the sheriff. To understand what the sheriff is, you have to go back before the Wild West. You have to actually go back to England. That's the origins of the office. And the best way to explain what a sheriff is, the sheriff's an officer of the court, conservator of the peace, and he collects taxes. And if people have difficulty believing that, just read Robin Hood. So what the Sheriff of Nottingham was doing in Robin Hood is exactly what sheriffs do today. So this is something that the colonists, this concept of the sheriff is something that the English colonists brought over to the United States, and its thought process spread out as the colonists spread out. And they brought this concept of a law enforcement official that would be kind of do a little bit of everything. So what we do is really no different than what other sheriffs do and what the sheriffs did in England. We carry out the mandates of the courts. So that's important. If you ever watch any of these movies, very, very subtly, even though because it's not really part of the plot, you'll see that a lot of what the sheriff is doing is carrying out the mandates of the court, arresting somebody who is wanted off of a warrant of arrest, let's say. So that's one of the functions of the sheriff, is to arrest people who are wanted, to apprehend fugitives. Another aspect of sheriffing is to preserve the peace. So if there's a fight or some type of dispute, the sheriff's duty would be to stop people from fighting or having a dispute. That's something that you see in a Western. It's something that you see today. Deputy sheriffs come across an issue. Their job is to stop that type of breach of the peace. And so the fundamentals of the job have not changed. Just how we go about doing it and the types of work that take up more of our day has changed over time.
A little history. This is our museum. Ooh, sheriff history. You can see we're at the World Trade Center situation. We're involved in that at 9/11. We had that, some of the operations that were going on. Some of our equipment we used to use. We used to have a scarf tow program we were involved in. Just some of the things we use. That tow program. That's some of our history.
Awesome.
And this is some old stuff from like 100 years ago, what the sheriff used to do, involved in stuff.
It was a strange series of circumstances that led me to becoming a deputy sheriff and then ultimately the sheriff. I was working at Orchard Beach selling hot dogs, and it was a very good job. It's probably the most lucrative job per hour that I've ever made in my entire career. And while I worked at Orchard Beach, the police department was handing out flyers for the upcoming police exam. I was 16 years old. They were handing out flyers for the police exam, and I read it, and it said that you could take the exam at 16 and a half. So I had no intentions of taking the exam. I brought the application home, I put it on my dresser. My father happened to see it, and he said, "Well, Joe, are you going to take the police exam?" I said, "I think I'm too young." He says, "No, you could be 16 and a half. And I said, "Well, but you can't be a police officer until you're 21. He says, "Yeah, but you never know. You could be called for other jobs off the police list." And I remember I told my father, "Well, maybe when you took civil service exams, that's how things happened, but I never heard of that happening." But I took the exam. I scored very well. I think my list number was 48. And I got a letter from the police department asking if I was interested in becoming a police officer. My father said, "Go down for the process." At that point, I was 17. I went down for the process. They told me, of course, I was too young, and they would call me when I was 21. A couple of months later, I get a letter from the sheriff's office, same issue, saying that they took my name off the NYPD exam that I had taken, and they wanted to know if I was interested in being a deputy sheriff. My father said, "Sheriff's office, that's almost an impossible job to get, but you should go down for the interview anyway." I went down for the interview, and I remember I was in competition with two other people, a correction officer and a court officer. So I assumed I had no law enforcement experience, that the correction officer or the court officer would get the job over me. And right before the interview started, they handed out these little pieces of paper. It had a simple math problem on it, interest calculations. And I was an English major, that was my plan, and I wasn't very good at math, but it was a simple calculation. You had to do simple interest. They gave us each one of these little flyers. We submitted the answers. They called us in for the interview. They noted that I got the answers correct, and then they asked me if I was interested in having the job after the interview, so I said yes. And then probably around 3 weeks later, after I was employed, I asked the people who interviewed me, why did you select me over the other two individuals? And they said, well, they were both in their 30s, and while they both knew how to shoot, they didn't know how to add. And since you were able to do the math problems, we figured we could teach you to shoot easier than we could teach them how to add. And that's how I got the job.
All right, awesome.
It's a true story. Yeah. So when I was a sergeant, I was assigned to make an arrest in the family court unit. And my partner and I went out to arrest this individual. And we could never catch him. It was a very bizarre situation. He was a very short man who was very heavy. And he lived at one location and stood at his girlfriend's house, which was several blocks away. And we were very resource strapped at that point in time, so there was only our unit available. So we'd go to arrest him at this home, he'd be at the other place. And we'd go to the other place, he'd be at the other home. So this went on a couple of times, and we really wanted to catch this individual. So we went to one location, knew he wasn't there, and quickly headed to the new location. On the way there, we see him. So this little short, fat guy run into a car and take off. So we pursue him, and we're following him. And it's a snowy, rainy day. And we're getting closer and closer to him. And as we're getting just about on to where we could be able to pull him over, a whole crowd of people come out in the street and start doing this. They start waving their arms, they start flagging us down. And I realized there's something wrong. And so I said, okay, we can pursue him, but we have all these people here waving us down, asking for help. So we pull over, and we decide, let's find out why these people, a whole mass of them, ran into the street waving their arms. We get out, and we find this 15-year-old boy who got shot in the chest. He's lying on the floor, he was shot in the chest. He was shoveling snow and collecting money for shoveling snow. And apparently, 3 other youths came over and robbed him. They wanted the money that he made from shoveling snow. And when he didn't turn the money over, they shot him in the chest. So he was lying on the floor, he was conscious, he was very scared. There happened to be a Good Samaritan, a nurse was there with him. So we stood there. We found out all the information about the 3 suspected shooters. We got a description. We put the description of the shooters out in their direction of flight. We call for an ambulance, and we call for NYPD. NYPD relates to us that there's another shooting on the other side of the precinct where most of their units are responding to at that point in time, and that they would send a unit as soon as possible. So we're waiting there, ambulance, we got the witnesses, young man is being put on the ambulance, and all of a sudden all the witnesses say, there they are. Those are the guys that shot him. Because they gave us a description of a guy wearing a camouflage jacket, a certain height, and there they are. So my partner and I pursue them. We put over that they're now back at the scene, and we're pursuing them. At that point in time, we chased one down the street, and the transit police heard our radio call. They blocked off the street, and we were able to apprehend one of these individuals. So we take them back to the precinct, and I remember, this is like out of a movie, there was a detective assigned to this case. He looked like Santa Claus. He must have been about 55 years old. He had white hair, white beard, and he had a big belly. And he was interviewing all the witnesses, and we were witnesses as well. We were just sitting there waiting to be interviewed like everybody else. And the detective came out and said, you know, we're having great difficulty because everybody saw something, but when push comes to shove, they can't really point to, this is the person that did it. So I was getting a glass of water, and it was hot. And I had taken off I was wearing a uniform, and I had taken off my jacket. And at that time, we didn't have a 9mm, we had a revolver. So it was commonplace to carry 2 revolvers. I had my regular uniform revolver, and then I had a smaller revolver in the shoulder holster. And he saw me drinking the water in uniform, and he said, "Sheriff, would you be willing to go face to face in the lineup or the show-up?" And I said, "Sure," because they had like a two-way mirror, and everybody was going to do the two-way mirror. He says, "Okay, what I want you to do, I'm going to ask you the question now, and I want you to answer the question in one word, yes or no. So I'm going to ask you the question now." He's very specific about this. He said, the question is this the person that the witnesses identified? So the question is this the young man that the witnesses identified? And all I want you to do is when we're in the room, when I say, "Sheriff, what's your answer?" just tell me yes or just tell me no. Don't elaborate, don't go into any detail, just say yes or no, and I want you to walk in just like that. I said, "Okay." A few minutes later, detective calls me in. I'm standing there. The youth is sitting, the detective is sitting across from him. He says, "Okay, Sheriff, what do you say?" I say, look at him, and I say, "Yes. He was the person that the witnesses identified. I didn't see him shoot anybody, but the witnesses pointed him out to me saying he was the shooter." He said, "Thank you, Sheriff." I leave. About 20 minutes later, the detective comes out. He's got a long list. He comes over to me and he's thanking me profusely. He says, "Okay, he was able to give me that it was his buddy's gun, and his buddy is the one that shot him and did everything, gave us the whole detail about what happened." And I asked the detective what happened. He says, "Well, I told him that the sheriff could positively identify the shooter. And I said, when you came in and said yes, it made him believe that you were identifying him as the shooter. But that wasn't the question I asked you. But that's what he believed." And from that, they were able to go out and arrest the suspect. They found the firearm, and they were able to make an arrest in that case.
Firearms are kept in these two safes, and like I said, just various equipment also serves as our armory for ammunition as well.
It's funny because I have always referenced my entire career the sheriff as a third person. And even as sheriff, I still reference the sheriff as a third person, as an officer, that it's not really me, it's something else, like I'm just the stand-in for some greater office. The sheriff and the deputy are considered one and the same, and that's a unique relationship in the law. A deputy just means one who carries out the same responsibilities and duties as the primary. So the deputy and the sheriff are literally the same officer. So what the sheriff does, the deputy does. I thought it was always important that the sheriff represent that. So for me, I wore a uniform my whole career. I felt that sheriff would be appropriate that I wear a uniform because I'm asking the deputies to wear a uniform. Well, the same things that a deputy has to do that I'm willing to do because they're supposed to be me. So that means that if they're wearing that, that means I should be wearing that because they're supposed to be emulating me. It's kind of a weird relationship that you want the deputies to follow your lead, but you also have to kind of follow their lead. You can't put yourself and say, do what I say, not as I do. I also think that whenever you take a group of people and you put them in uniform, it creates a bond, it creates an organization, and that's what you want. You want everybody to work together in an organization and believe in something greater than yourself in order to get something done. So yes, I would say that there is a strong bond, and plus we're small. You know, in a big city where 125 deputy sheriffs and 20 criminal investigators, that's large as far as sheriff's offices go in the state. It's small when you compare us to NYPD.
Like a little memorial, people who had passed away that were actually deputy sheriffs, so they put a little memorial here.
The first time I ever pointed my gun at somebody, this is what I was like. And that's a very truthful statement. I went through all this training, everything was great, but when you point the gun at somebody, it's a very, very scary experience. If I remember the first time I pointed my gun, I started shaking and I had to hold my hand and I had to make sure it was firm, but I was scared. What happened over time is when you start becoming responsible for other people, it makes it easier for you not to be afraid. So when you're worried about yourself, it's very easy to be frightened. When you're now worried about somebody behind you, to your left, to your right, Now you have responsibility, and if you have any sense of responsibility, you realize you have to suck it up and bury it. So early on I said, okay, you know what? I'm gonna be afraid, but I'm gonna be afraid after everything is over. So I made that commitment to myself that after everything was said and done, I would be afraid. And then what I found is when everything was said and done, I was so relieved, I didn't need to be afraid.
Go ahead, ready, go. Could you bench press this?
Yeah.